All right. I could talk for a bit, just kind of hold as people come in. My name is Evan Clark. I'm Executive Director of Atheists United in Los Angeles. We're a community-based organization that has been organizing in Southern California since 1982. We host a fourth Sunday speaker series. We have a membership program that's the largest in California, and we organize the secular non-religious community for activism, community service, community, and beyond. If you're interested in a membership with our organization, it's only $45 a year, and we'd love for you to become a part of it. You can then run for our board of directors. You can vote on major initiatives when we are deciding on them. You can, hey Google, stop. I had my laundry alarm just go off. All right, we are currently doing a fundraising campaign, trying to get up to $1,000 this week. If you'd like to participate in that, you can check out our Facebook page. But beyond our fourth Sunday speaker program, we host something called a pop-up speaker series, which is what you're participating in today. We try to find the best speakers traveling around the country and getting them to join us when they're in Los Angeles. Obviously, since COVID-19, there's not much traveling happening, but we're still getting people for virtual talks throughout the year. So I'm really excited for you all to be joining us today. We have an incredible speaker. Format of today's meeting, I'll do a quick introduction of the speaker. We'll hop right into it. We'll give his presentation, and then we'll do Q&A. Q&A will be facilitated by me, so please put your questions in the chat if you'd like your questions read. We will not be opening the mics to everyone. We will be reading the questions to keep things focused and managed on our online meetings. For those of you curious about Atheists United and our meetings in general, we are not doing any in-person meetings for the rest of 2020, and we'll reassess in 2021 about in-person events. The only in-person events we are doing are community service projects, so please don't swing by our building. And there's no need to call us and ask about in-person meetings. We have canceled all in-person meetings for safety. And we hope you check out our website of all of our upcoming events, again, because everything has moved online. Cool, with that, let's get started. I wanna introduce our speaker and we can hop right into it. Today we're hosting Dr. Juhem Navarro-Rivera, who's the managing partner and director of the political research at Socioanalítica Research. He's also co-chair of the Latinx Humanist Alliance, serves on the board of directors for the American Humanist Association, excuse me, and is a senior fellow at the Institute for Humanist Studies. He currently writes the Nonedecision 2020 column for thehumanist.com and Humanist Magazine about the nuns and their role in American politics. We're thrilled to be hosting him today from Washington, D.C., and I will now give you the floor. I'll clap. Rah, rah, like this.
Thank you, Evan. Can you hear me? I'm not sure if I muted myself.
You're doing great.
Again. Okay, I'm not muted myself. Thank you, Evan and Atheists United for hosting me. It was interesting because right before COVID, Evan invited me to go to LA right as I was taking a flight to California. And that was a good visit, but it was a dreadful flight. And I was wondering if I was ever gonna go back to California I was really thinking about whether I wanted to hop on another cross-country flight this year. And then a lot of stuff happened and I couldn't do anything until now, but I'm glad because I really like the work that Atheists United has been doing, and I like their Facebook page and like all the events and activities that they do in the community. So I'm really grateful that I was finally able to make it, although virtually. As Evan said, like I right now I'm more active in the humanist secular world than when I started doing these kind of talks and my research on secularism. Before I started my own company, Socioanalítica Research, who does a lot of work with progressive organizations, data work like survey research, focus groups, and data analysis. I was a pollster at what it was then known as Public Religion Research Institute, now has rebranded as PRRI, who's done some really good work on religion and public opinion. And before that, I was at the Institute for the Study of Secularism in Society and Culture back in Trinity College, which was the center that released the famous survey of the knowns back in 2009. So I've been doing this kind of research for over a decade now. And, you know, it has been evolving as, you know, we get more data and you know, we kind of like get more information, and the knowns have grown. And in this particular talk, I wanna talk of three aspects of the knowns. I wanna start with kind of like, you know, the state of the knowns demographically and how they pair with other important political religious groups, or as I kind of like to tell them, religion groups, because the knowns technically are not religious, so it's not a religious group. And then moving on there to talk a little bit about political participation. One of the Nonedecision 2020 columns that I did for the Humanists that actually was released earlier in the week was about voter turnout and a lot of, I wouldn't call it disinformation or misinformation, but a lot of misinterpretation about how, you know, the electoral behavior of the non, particularly their voter turnout. And I want to close a little bit with some issues, basically where the knowns stand on some issues and how the knowns in some ways are shaping public opinion in the United States. And what I say, what I call that their cultural impact, or at least their political impact in the culture has been stronger than in the electoral arena. And then with some conclusions about like why, what I think is going to happen in 2020 and potentially beyond from this particular election in November. So cutting to the chase, oh, I need my, yeah. We're going to start a little bit with the demographic change. And so one of the things that when I was working back in 2008 with the knowns data was that it was heavily male, like compared to other groups or religion cohorts. It was definitely one of the most lopsided, heavily male. Now looking at the most recent data that I could get my hands on, and thanks to PRRI for that, this comes from their American Values Atlas, those ratios have changed slightly. In just 10 years, it has gone down from 60-40 to 55-45, and in some regards, that is huge. If we look back to the earliest data that we have comparable to the 2008 data, which was in 1990, for the American Religious Identification Survey, or what back then was the National Survey of Religious Identification, that ratio had not changed in nearly 20 years. So just seeing that change in just a decade in which more women are actually identifying as knowns is really interesting. And a couple, or maybe, oh my gosh, we're in 2020. So kind of like 4 or 5 years ago, I co-author a book chapter actually looking at these gender disparities. And one of the things that we found, me and my co-author, Dr. Jasmine Trejo, was that in those years intervening after 2008, actually the ratio of men and women who are not identified as religious has actually been balanced. So as many women as men now identify as knowns in the younger cohorts. And that fares well for the knowns in terms of, like, you know, the demographic balance and also like the potential growth of the groups, I mean, which many people didn't think was going to grow as fast as it did back in the earliest years of 2008, 2009, 2010. But it's also not the set ratios that have changed. What has happened with the knowns is that it have also grown in terms of racial diversity. And this is one of the things that actually has been apparent for a while, but it's, or actually has been a thing for a while, has been data point for a while, going back to probably 2008, was a slightly more wider demographic, but it has actually started to reflect the nation's demographics among adults, particularly. And so it's a change or it's a trend that is actually compared to the two largest religious groups, Catholics and Protestants, that it reflects better how the U.S. population looks like. For example, Catholics are kind of like bipolarly, either white from these earlier migration from Italians, Poles, Irish, and then you have a lot of Latinx influence in the church or in the church demographics, and with Protestants has been mostly black and white affair in terms of race, with a significant cohort of Latinx moving toward Protestantism in the last century, but actually the numbers of Protestants in the Latinx community has actually plateaued probably since the early 2000s. And so what we're seeing is that the growth among Latinxes particularly has been among the knowns, but also among African Americans and Asian Americans. So and especially among those younger cohorts. So the group is becoming more diverse. So that particular cohort of the knowns is becoming more diverse. And of course, they are much younger than particularly the other two religious cohorts. So their share of people who are under 30 of the knowns, it's like almost twice that of Protestants. And of course, if you look at the other side of the ledger, over 65, the knowns are much younger than than Catholics and Protestants. And that has actually fueled a lot of the growth of the knowns, has been like these younger people in some ways disaffiliating from religion, and younger people, as we saw before, from any sex identity, and definitely from all racial and ethnic groups. So this growth has been not a thing of a particular demographic, but has been basically an American phenomenon distributed across everybody, so to speak. And here in this presentation and in most of my presentation, I have done a lot of comparisons between the knowns and the white evangelicals, mostly because of these, in terms of political differences. The knowns are more likely, the voting patterns are kind of like the reverse white evangelicals. They're more democratic. We're gonna get into that one later in the presentation. But also, in terms of politics, like if you look at the issues, how their stand of issues, they are usually like polar opposites. And also, if you look at them demographically, they're also polar opposites. So the biggest cohorts among the knowns are the under 30s and the under 50s. And among the white evangelicals, is actually their biggest cohort is the over 50. And they essentially, their ratios and their proportions, the age groupings are actually reversed. Which also tells you a lot in terms of like how these groups relate to each other in the political arena. So they cater to not only different age cohorts, but also like, white evangelicals, well, of course, by definition, all white. So these groups also more diverse. The knowns are also more diverse in that regard. And that also has an impact on the politics and the political participation. And one of the things now, getting a little bit more into politics, now that with his introduction of these comparisons with white evangelicals, is that when you look at party affiliation of the knowns, and in this one I use the Cooperative Congressional Election Study, which most of these data, I wouldn't say all of it, but most of the data sources I am using are actually, you can download and play with them, and actually, get to replicate them if you may. So looking at the party affiliation of knowns, now I'm going to start moving toward the politics of the group. So the knowns are heavily Democratic leaning. So people who identify as Democrat or identify as independent, but then say that they lean as Democrats, are more essentially the majority. So the majority of knowns identify as Democrats, 57%. But contrary to other religion groups, like Catholics, for example, where like white Catholics are much more Republican than Latinx Catholics, who tend to be heavily Democratic, or Protestants, in which white Protestants are heavily Republican and Black Protestants are heavily Democratic, and then Latinx Protestants fall somewhere in the middle. All the knowns, all racial subgroups or subcohorts within the knowns actually lean Democratic. So it's a really interesting part. They kind of reflect also the larger demographic patterns of partisanship. So whites tend to be less Democratic and more Republican than Blacks and Hispanics or Latinxes. But essentially, like these kind of political agreements, so to speak, within a major religious cohort is something that we haven't seen in a while, given that seeing how white Catholics and Latino Catholics and white and Black Protestants actually have very dissimilar religion or political party affiliations. And then these has also affected the distribution of party coalitions. So, Republicans are more likely to be Protestants, while Democrats, they kind of like the biggest cohort is also Protestant, but comparing like their share of the U.S. Democrats are slightly more Democratic, and Protestants are slightly more Republican. Or actually, Republicans are slightly more Protestants, and Democrats are slightly more non-religious than party. And then the independents are slightly more non-religious, and there you have a lot of independents who are also from other religious groups, and that's why you see that the numbers do not add to 100, essentially, because I'm just focused on these three groupings. But that sets up the discussion about like how the knowns have influenced political parties and how the demographics of the knowns align with essentially what is going on, like being young, being or an increasing number of women, an increasing number of people of color have essentially strengthened those kind of like democratic leaning partisan leanings that the knowns had way before like there was this explosion of people identifying as knowns. And I'm not going to go into the causal mechanisms of whether like people are leaving religion because they are mad at religion and disaffiliating, and then that's I think that other people have written more about that than I have done. But what it's certainly clear is that all the demographic changes between within the knowns and that have in American population have actually had some impact in the party coalitions. Now I want to get a little bit into political participation. Essentially, I want to look a little bit into voter turnout and voting patterns of the knowns. So in this chart, this one was from one of my first non-decision columns, was looking at the known vote since 1980 using exit polls. So in 1976, I could have done this since 1976, but the 1976 religion question in the exit polls was drastically different from the one that they started using in 1980. So they're apples to oranges comparing these two numbers. So I started in 1980 in the Reagan election. And so in every election since at least 1980, the knowns have voted, at least a plurality of knowns have voted for the Democratic candidate. So in 1980, 41% voted for Jimmy Carter, 36% voted for Ronald Reagan. And that's kind of like the last time that the vote of the nones was kind of like in play. Essentially, since 1984, like a clear majority of the nones have voted for the Democratic candidate. And since 2004, essentially 2/3 of the nones have voted for the Democratic candidate. And they have topped at least 60% in most of the elections. The Republican vote has been more varied. And that has happened for a couple of reasons. I didn't add in this chart the independent votes, so voting for third-party candidates and independent candidates, but the nones have a disproportionate amount of people who vote for third-party candidates. That has to do a lot with their partisanship. Like they have a larger share of, or a pretty large share of people who identify as independent. So they're not just only religiously not affiliated, but they're also politically independent in many ways. And there's a lot of third-party independent candidate votes. And particularly in these elections, we see in 1980, that there was like for those of us, well, actually I'm not old enough to remember that election, but I've read enough about it that I think I remember it. In the 1980 election, there were a few candidates, particularly John Anderson, who was a Republican, a moderate Republican from Illinois, who, especially among the nones, siphoned votes away, not just from Ronald Reagan, but also from Jimmy Carter. By 1984, like a lot of those people went back to their old parties, and you see it's kind of like 60-40 kind of ratio. And then in 1988, like then they go back 36% vote for George Bush the first. And then a few things happened in between 1992 and 2000. And what's happened in 1992 and 1996, Ross Perot, essentially among the nones, took votes away from essentially George Bush and Bob Dole. So everything that the proportion of the vote that would have gone to a conservative or a Republican actually went to the third party in those years, while the Democrats, the vote for Bill Clinton actually kind of like remained constant. And in 2000, interestingly, like Ralph Nader got a lot of the secular vote, but that didn't actually seem to affect none of the candidates, the two major candidates, whether it was Al Gore and George W. Bush. And then, like since then, the Republican vote has actually, especially after 2008, has stayed at about a quarter. Barack Obama like broke the record of non-support in exit polls with 75%, and John McCain actually wasn't the lowest because that was George Herbert Walker Bush's re-election in '92. But essentially, like the Republican vote hasn't nearly recovered since the 2004 election. So since 2008, it actually hasn't reached 30% again, at least in the exit poll analysis. But one of the things that people have been saying about the nones is that they don't really vote, that nones are less likely to participate than other groups, that they punch below their weight. And as the group has been increasing, there's talks about like why the nones don't vote. And a lot of these discussion comes from a comparison that is kind of like apples to oranges again. So the nones are, let's looking at 2016, there were 24% of the population, but in the exit polls, the analysis showed that they were 15% of respondents of the exit polls. While white evangelicals, for example, they were 17% of the population in major surveys like the PRI and Pew surveys. But they were only, they were actually about like a quarter of the electorate in the exit polls. And they say that, you know, like if you calculate turnout that way, which I kind of like did back of the envelope, it tells you that at a 55% national turnout that was estimated, essentially the voter turnout of evangelicals was 84% and the nones was 34%, which is, yes, awful. If you look at the knowns, but also white evangelicals was like ridiculously high compared to other groups. So I decided to, in that piece that you can look at the humanist.com, it's in one of their front pages right now, and if not, you can look up for Nonedecision 2020. And what you can, I use the comparative congressional election study, which is a large survey that is done every 2 years. I think actually it's done annually, but certainly has an election component every 2 years for congressional elections. And they have some vote validation measures that are pretty good and let us analyze how groups voted. And in this case, the national turnout was 55%. White evangelicals turnout was 64%, which is not bad, and you know it was expected. Like it's a highly motivated group. But the knowns actually were, the turnout of the knowns was 51%. So it wasn't higher than evangelicals. Certainly was a little lower than the national average, but certainly wasn't a 50-point deficit compared to white evangelicals. It was like something more akin of 13 points difference, and something that makes a lot of sense when we look at the demography of these particular groups. So, for example, if we look at a comparison of voter turnout by age against, again, using the CCEF survey, what we find is that, particularly in the older cohort and 60 plus, the knowns and evangelicals actually look alike. The known voter turnout is actually lower among the younger cohorts. But actually the known voter turnout, it's actually pretty good even compared to when we compare it to the national numbers compared to their age group. So white evangelicals, young people, very likely to participate, and especially going to the 30s and going to up to the 40s and to the 60s. At that oldest cohort is when the knowns can finally reach the turnout of the of the white evangelicals. Now, if we look at the age distribution of voters, we can see what's happening. Like knowns are twice, or the younger cohort among the knowns, 18 to 29, are actually twice as large within the white evangelicals. So they're younger than the general population overall, and that's why you see that the overall numbers of the knowns are slightly lower than the general population, because essentially we have, the knowns have a younger cohort, and those numbers actually depress to some extent the overall turnout of the turnout levels of the group. But what we're saying is that essentially, as as a lot of the voter turnout literature shows, that as people get older, their voter turnout increases, and essentially this is also true for the knowns. Another thing that I wanted to point out, which it's that looking back at their partisanship from those earlier slides, the knowns have a lot of people who are Democrats or lean Democrats, and a bunch of people who identify as independents. That is not necessarily the case with evangelicals. So not only the youth of the knowns is a factor in their voter turnout, but also there's a factor in terms of their partisanship. And partisans and strong partisans are more willing to go out and vote, and more enthusiastic about going out and vote in elections. And this is also a major difference between evangelicals and knowns. The fact that white evangelicals are a major cohort, or the main cohort within the Republican coalition. They are highly motivated and have very strong party identification, while the knowns not only are younger, but also have weaker party allegiances that essentially depresses their turnout one way or the other, because there's also few Republicans, a lot of conservative knowns that don't really identify as Republicans and prefer to identify as political independents. But even if we look at their political impact in terms of voter turnout, like pulling below their weight or punching below their weight, or in the an aspect that I'm not gonna get into today, which is elected officials. Very few knowns are in elective office, and you know, it makes a lot of sense if we look at the demographics of the group. But essentially, what is being happening is that the political impact of knowns, whether it's voter turnout or people running for office and being elected in office, and in terms of, like, you know, the Faith Caucus, or now we have a Free Thought Caucus in Congress. Not all of them are non-religious, so there's a lot of allies in that group, and that's great as a starter. But I argue, and I think that the cultural impact of knowns in politics is actually greater than what that has been their electoral impact, and it's something that should not be underestimated. And this came to me, you know, many years ago, like 7 years ago. I was working at PRI, and we were working on this report looking at the 10 years of public opinion on same-sex marriage, doing a take back on 2003. And in 2003, only a third of the country was in favor of same-sex marriage. This was an issue that moved very fast in terms of public opinion. Like in 10 years, a majority of the country was already supporting same-sex marriage. But in 2003, back when essentially nobody was supporting the issue, and the knowns were about 13, 14% of the population, depending on what kind of surveys you were getting. 65% of the knowns were supporting same-sex marriage, more than any other religion cohort. Not only more than any other religion cohort, no other religion cohort like Protestant Catholic of Protestants and Catholics were actually reaching majority at that point. By 2013, the country as a whole supported, majority became supportive of same-sex marriage. And not only that, like knowns at that point had reached almost 75% support. What happened between 2003 and 2013, it's also that, you know, the knowns went from being essentially less than 1 in 6, about 13, 14% of the population, to essentially become, at that point, was 22, 23% of the population. So the growth, to some extent, the knowns of the growth of the knowns was fueling changes in public opinion, but that also means that, you know, like in general, like other groups were changing, but the young people who were fueling a lot of these changes were essentially a lot of knowns. And, you know, it happens because not only knowns were more accepting of same-sex marriage, like analysis from PRI, Gallup, and other groups, polling houses have found that LGBTQ people tend to be disproportionately non-religious. An analysis from PRI back in 2016, 2017 found that 47% of people who identify with the LGBTQ community identified as non-religious. So this is for the known. Same-sex marriage hasn't really been an external issue just to be liberal for the heck of it, but also is an issue that was deeply close and deeply dear to many people within the community. And that's something that I always want to stress in my presentations, is that, you know, when we look at the knowns, we look at this diversity, as I talked at the beginning, in terms of gender or sex identity, and in terms of race and age, but also in terms of sexual orientation. Like the knowns is a very diverse group, and so the knowns are care a lot about many issues, but it's not just because they are liberal in the abstract, but essentially because there are issues that also affect them as people who are young, who are people of color, who are women, who are gay, lesbian, queer, and transgender. And so looking at those opinions, for example, looking at the CCES again, the knowns are more likely to support DACA than the general population looking at immigration. They're less likely to agree that racial problems are isolated incidents of, particularly incidents of racism or even incidents with the police, as we have seen the protests this year, taking Black Lives Matter protest this year, taking a new life after that initial wave in 2013, 2014. They support making abortion, not abortion, always legal. I think when I hit enter, I actually delete the A. And in terms of environmental issues, support strengthening and enforcement of the Clean Air and Water Acts, so the Clean Air and the Clean Water Acts. And this one, in terms of like gender issues, like we see that in terms of feminism, nobody agrees with feminism in this country, or at least there's a very low agreement, which is really, really not nice. But the knowns are also above the general population in those regards. And so when we look at how issues are evolving, we need to look at how the knowns are growing and how the knowns are looking, because essentially what they are a disproportionate amount of people who identify as liberal, who vote for Democratic candidates, and who support these kind of positions. And so when you're thinking about how public opinion is shifting on some issues, think about how the role that the knowns may be having compared to other religion cohorts. And so, as you see in these chart, is the share of the knowns among the people who support these issues or oppose these issues. The knowns are about 29% in the CCES of the general population, but they are a disproportionate amount, particularly looking at abortion and environmental matters like the in strengthening the Clean Air Act as a disproportionate amount of people who support those causes. So they're actually in many ways driving public opinion, and in many ways like influencing politicians just by the way they are expressing themselves, even if their electoral impact and their impact in public office is much smaller. And so I want to start wrapping up. I've been told that these groups have very vigorous Q&A sessions, and so I kind of like went a little bit fast on this. But I want you to give you a few like summaries. Like in terms of demographic change, there's been increasing sex parity among the knowns. It's not only a male-dominated group, but essentially like a lot of women have been joining the demographic in the last few years. And it's not only women, but also people of color, like Black Americans, Latinx Americans, Asian Americans are actually an increasing number of, an increasing part of the non-religious cohort. And of course, the young have been a major source of that growth. They're more aligned in their politics by race than any other major religion group. And they're becoming a larger share of the party's coalition, particularly the Democrats. And you should expect that this is going to continue in the near future. In terms of political participation, the knowns are heavily Democratic in their voting patterns. And they support for Democrats speak in 2008, but it actually has been at least 67% since 2004. Don't compare exit poll data with population data to try to calculate the non-turnout, please. Use other kind of data that it's more unified in that regard. But also think about the youth of the knowns and the party attachment or the party affiliation of knowns when you're thinking about like why may be this lower turnout of knowns anyway. In terms of public opinion, just stressing that the knowns have been leading public opinion for a while, and as they become more relevant or grow a larger group in the population, that impact may be increasing. So their electoral impact may be small right now, but their cultural impact in the public opinion has been amazing. And then, so what to expect in 2020, to close it off with what the title of the talk was going to be anyway. I should expect similar voting patterns, so a majority Democratic and with Republican minority, essentially. Not sure if it's going to move much either way, but Socioanalítica Research, so we did a survey last year, the 2019 Secular Voices survey, and what we found is that only 24% of nons had a favorable opinion of the president, and only 13% plan on voting for him. So I don't think that's going to change things in many ways. One of the things is among Democrats, the top three choices were Bernie Sanders, Joe Biden, and Elizabeth Warren. So how people who supported were in favor of Bernie's nomination or Warren's or are gonna move, that depends. But actually, Joe Biden had a lot of support within the nons in the run up to 2020. Not surprisingly, a majority have a positive opinion of the Democratic Party. A minority have a positive opinion of the Democratic Party, but thinking about issues for this election in which the coronavirus is actually taking a big chunk of attention, the top three issues were healthcare, jobs, and climate change. Three things that the coronavirus has actually not changed. People are concerned about their jobs, people are concerned about healthcare, and people are concerned about climate change, and the nons are groups, particularly among climate change, that care the most. And as I said before, they're, especially within the Democratic coalition, they're probably going to become more influential just because of the voting patterns and party ID. But you know, as they grow, as their size grows in the population, they probably continue to be leading this shift in public opinion. So that's it for now. I'm looking forward to your questions, and you can take it from it, Evan.
Great, thank you so much. We have a lot of questions coming in, so I'm gonna start reading those to you right now. The first one was an international question. So are the ideological differences between nuns and other religious groups consistent across borders, such as countries with a less prominent role for Protestants in public policy?
That's an excellent question. So I've written international about the nuns, but was mostly in Latin America and was mostly about beliefs. I haven't done much on political attitudes, mostly because any comparativist, as we say, the people who do political science, the comparative politics, will tell you like it's an apples to orange comparisons in terms of like politics. Issues vary. One of the things we're looking at is particularly some issues in Latin America, like there were those gaps between evangelicals, you know, this growing segment of evangelicals growing in Latin America, and the people who were non-religious. But one of the interesting things that I found about Latin America, and particularly some countries more than others, is that the nuns tend to be more upper class than they are in the United States. In the United States, a lot, especially in the post-2008 boom, has been a lot of, you know, people of color, women, and but also a lot of people with like, you know, that are not wealthy people with PhDs or things like that, or like wealthy industry leaders and anything like that. So it's a more populist secularism in the United States, I would say, in terms of demographics. And I would think that in some ways that would affect the politics, because you would have like probably a more economically conservative cohort in other countries than you would have in the United States. But that's, I don't have much evidence for that other than demographic.
Sure. We had a question about, do you see, or does the data point to evangelicals continuing to dominate the Republican Party?
I think Sarah Poffner was probably better positioned to answer that last week. But I mean, I think in terms of the GOP, yeah, likely because they're just such a big chunk of the coalition, and right now they are the strongest Trump supporters, even within the party. So yes, and I think part of in terms of how they are acting politically, I mean, I think it's a long-term agenda, and I think Sam McGuire's talk was probably a good primer for that. But essentially, yes, in terms of the people who are kingmakers in the Republican Party, and in terms of the people who are the core of the electoral base, yes, they would, unless something happens overnight, which doesn't seem that it will. I think that's certain that the evangelicals are going to be very influential for a long time in the Republican Party.
I had a question off of that. I've been in a few meetings at the national level where there's debate about whether the secular community can be a cohort the way it feels like evangelical communities are when it comes to voting patterns. Do you think that we can function in coalition and coordination at the levels that they do? Or is there some major differences because of our identities or values?
That depends. Are you talking in terms of building coalitions with other religion cohorts, or do you mean like becoming a dominant cohort within the Democratic coalition?
I think they mean more of like a voting bloc, where there seems to be such a not certainty, but there seems to be such a commitment to voting together for specific candidates or directions, and using the most powerful people in their identification to organize for that.
Okay, how much think we have? No, but, I mean, so for years I've been calling the knowns an organic cohort, an organic bloc. Like they've been, like, if you look at those voting patterns, like that's a bloc. Like, they're essentially as Democrats as Latinxs are. And to some extent, they're like, Republicans are like, the evangelicals are kind of like 80, 85, maybe 80% Republicans. So, I mean, it's kind of like a little bit of a mirror image. The difference is that it's an organic group. Like they're voting but there's been no real organized effort to harness it. And it's kind of interesting because I think there's within the secular organizations, like the big groups, like the main issue is separation of church and state, which I mean makes sense given the origins of a lot of the groups and like the impact of religion in public policy and whatnot. But the Secular Voices survey, for example, that we did last year, like we ranked all those issues, and I told you the top three were like healthcare, jobs, and climate change. Separation of church and state was in that list and was like number 10 of 10. So it's an issue that people care. And if you tell them about particular specific policies, like kind of like ending religious exemptions to vaccinations and stuff like that, there will be high support, but it's not necessarily a high priority. Like people are, as I said before, like the knowns are, especially American knowns, are kind of like more populist than in other countries, and in that sense, and by populist I mean that their demographics are kind of like similar in terms of economics and other characteristics, and that means that their concerns are similar to the general American population. Now, how you harness that non-religious group within those issues? I mean, I think climate change is an issue that, because of the intersection of science that it has, it's a good issue, and I think secular organizations should be leading to some extent, or in partnership with environmental groups in climate change, just because it's an issue that it's core to what non-religious voters want. But yeah, like I think there is a block, and it just hasn't been harnessed. So like to some extent, Democrats would take the nones for granted because they vote for them, but there's like no much interest, and there's no like now there's a free thought at the Center for Free Thought Equality and the Free Thought Equality Pact, but secular organizations have to some extent not played aggressively in the political arena for some reasons that make sense, others that I think it's being too cautious and ceding the ground.
Good answer. All right, we have a question about if the political parties such as the Democrats have used any of this data for targeting or outreach or increased turnout. Is there any sense that their parties are reacting to these changing demographic data?
Well, they haven't talked to me. I don't know if some of their strategies are using it. I mean, the only evidence right now is at least before 2020. I don't think there was. At least in 2020, there has been some effort, and if you were watching the DNC, there were some events by non-religious people in there. There was a panel with Representative Hoffman, who co-chairs the Congressional Free Thought Caucus, who is the only non-theist in Congress right now, openly non-theist, and with some state legislators who are part of our groups. But I mean, before 2020, there was nothing like that. So I think there has been some change, particularly this year. But I mean, is it going to be sustained? I don't know. Is it going to be more than, hey guys, we know you exist, and yeah, it's nice, and we're going to give you some lip service, but we don't really want to talk much about you guys because Trump is attacking us on faith. So who knows?
There was a question about if you have researched or you've investigated the viewpoints of the religiously affiliated towards the nuns. Has that liberalized at all with the changing demographics?
So yes, mostly younger people are more have more positive views towards the nuns. But people are actually relatively positive toward the nuns. We ran an experiment some years ago in PRI where like we asked half the sample about like, these feeling thermometers in which you ask like, how warm do you feel toward particular groups? And in one half we asked about non-religious people, and the other one we ask about atheists, and like people don't like atheists, but they do like non-religious people. So yes, but I mean, I think again, because the nuns have become more visible, even atheists have become more visible. I think to some extent that acceptance is growing, and especially among the younger, who also tend to be more likely non-religious or more likely to non-religious people, those attitudes have changed.
Do a significant number of nuns become religious as they age, or can we anticipate larger numbers of older nuns in the future?
It's an excellent question. At least from the current cohort, there's no evidence for that, and I'm not sure if there's a lot of evidence for that in previous generations. I think one of the things is, and I'm not going to go into sociology because I'm not a sociologist, but from what I understand, or I have understood the literature, like, there's a lot of people who may not identify or may not be very religious in terms of behavior as they're young. I mean, that makes sense. Like, younger people are less likely to go to church, even if they identify as religious. And then as they get older, like, they probably do these rites, like, like Catholics are going to get baptized, and or people who grew up Catholic are going to baptize their kids and not go to a church again, or they're going to get married and not go to a church again. That happened a lot in the past. I think people are more, I think one of the things that happened with the knowns is that people became more sincere in terms of like, you know what, no, I'm not. And I think as the public opinion started showing that there are large numbers of people with that identity, a lot of people decide to get rid of the mask of, like, so to speak, of like, yeah, you know. And what has happened, so to answer finally the question, what has happened is not that we're seeing evidence that people are growing religious as they grow older, is that older people are becoming non-religious. So like the main cohort of knowns is certainly the young, but even if you look at surveys over time, a larger share of older folks are identifying as non-religious. So I think it has just given people permission to be non-religious more than people trying to replicate or to fit into this, as they grow older, like looking back at those ancient communities that they actually never belonged to, but they were told they belonged to.
When it comes to the nuns, are there differences in opinions on issues based on age? For instance, are younger nuns more feminist than older nuns? And would that explain some of the, why we're not more supportive of feminist issues?
That particular question, I don't know. I actually didn't run the numbers for that. But in other issues, like particularly, yeah, like same-sex marriage, there are like differences in age, for example. And also, if you look at even at some economic issues, like younger people are kind of like more liberally conservative than older people. So yeah, there's some variation within the group. So yes, you see all those patterns, like I said before, in terms of partisanship. You see that in race. Like even though the majority of knowns identify as Democrats, regardless of race, you still see those patterns in which the group that's less likely to identify as Democrat, more likely to identify as Republicans, are the whites, and then blacks are most likely to identify as Democratic. And even those differs also between women and men.
There was a question about what are you going to study next? What's a burning question that you want to answer with your next studies?
That's a good question. I don't know. So, like nowadays I'm an independent researcher. Like I own my own consulting business, and I'm busy with election work right now, not related to the knowns. I'm hoping to release a new secular voices survey at some point, looking at the election, hopefully before October. But in terms of like longer term research agenda, if I have time, I would love to look at public officials more than voters. I think I've done enough about voters and I know enough about voters, so I'm more interested in public officials, mostly because my training in political science was looking at representation, and I was like doing a lot of research on Congress and state legislatures back in the day, and I would love to do that again.
I had a question about if there's any research that gets more detailed. Nuns is such a big category, and I'm curious if there's anything yet that gets more detailed in trying to separate out humanists and agnostics and atheists and some of the various labels, or spiritual but not religious, that sometimes squeeze under the nun category.
Yes, I mean there's a lot of variation there. And there's research in there. In political science, not as much as it is in sociology and particularly psychology. I'm seeing a lot of like psychological research coming into like the psychology of non-belief or non-affiliation and whatnot. In terms of, but yeah, there's the problem with with a lot of the public opinion data is that the ones I use are good and rare because they have so large sample sizes that you can disaggregate a lot of groups. But in most surveys, you can't really do that. Let's say like a regular survey of 1,000 people, if the knowns are 25% of population, you expect that you're gonna get like 250. and then to do some substantive analysis, and divide them in groups, it's really hard to do. But yes, to answer more concisely, yes, and there's some differences, and the other thing is it depends on how you ask. So some years ago, I won a bet in which the general questions that PU and PRI use for religious identification ask a list of religions, and then say, are you atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular? And so I would say, if I'm answering a question about that, I'm going to say nothing in particular because I don't think atheism is a religion. But if you ask those nothing in particular they identify as atheists, then the numbers of atheists are going to actually increase. And that's what happens. So there's a lot of overlap. The Secular Voices survey from last year actually found that the percentage of no's who are non-believers has increased. So I think if we are not full circle in terms of the Venn diagram of knowns and non-believers or atheists, but I think when those identification surveys come and people say their religion is atheist or agnostic, that's a particular subset and tend to be more activist atheists. They're more likely to belong to organizations. They're more likely to also be politically active. They're more keen into the separation of state issues, church and state issues. So there are some differences, but I think they're diminishing in some ways.
Okay, there was a question about what issue or two is most likely to motivate voters for an election like the one coming up? None specifically.
I think I think looking back, looking at particularly the secular voices is the coronavirus. People are concerned about healthcare, they're concerned about jobs, that they're concerned about the environment, and so those are major issues that have been exacerbated. They're also concerned about inequality, which was the number 4 issue. So those are issues that have, if any, gotten worse since the pandemic started. And so I think people motivated by that are probably going to be voting. But I think also to a large extent, and other surveys have come with that, but, I think a lot of motivation is going to come, particularly from the Democratic side and the Republican side, is how do you feel about the president? And I think that's going to drive a lot of the turnout. If you don't like the president, you want to go and vote. And if you like the president, you want to go out and vote. So I think these elections is going to probably mostly be referendum on the president than probably any other election that we have seen before. And I think the coronavirus is just something to pile on to those feelings.
Yeah. We'll do 1 or 2 more questions. It looks like, I think you had a slide on this, but there was a question about, do Latinx, Black, and Asian people have the same proportion of nuns as, let's say, a white evangelicals or evangelical identification?
No, there are more knowns that are there. Well, I mean, with the exception of Black Americans who are primarily evangelical in their Christian beliefs, and so the knowns among Black Americans are the second largest group. So they're like large cohort of Christian, particularly evangelicals, and then they're knowns, and then they're like Muslims. I believe that among Asian Americans, the knowns may be the largest cohort, or at least up there. And among the Latinx, what is happening is that in like a decade ago, like the majority of Catholics Latinx is identified as Catholic. And there was this growing segment of evangelicals or Protestants, because sometimes, especially among Latinx, the term is conflated. So any Protestant is called an evangelical, but not necessarily all evangelicals are, all Protestants are evangelicals. But right now, the percentage of Latinx that identify as known has surpassed the number of who identify as Protestant. And among the younger cohort, like the under 30, like nones or Catholics are neck to neck.
Okay, let's wrap up with how can we support your work, and how many others are there like you out there doing research in this space?
Political scientist, I don't know. If you want to support myself, you can hire me. I do survey research, so if you want to do like a membership survey, it's actually specialized in membership surveys. I do surveys for several organizations trying to get the opinion of their members. So if you want to do that, get in touch with me, UMNR@socioanalítica.com. And this work on the knowns that I'm mostly now doing as a hobby, or because I've been doing it for years, and now that I'm not working at university, it's a passion. I probably can start a PayPal or something, or and if you can, I could use help to fund more of these kind of surveys. So if that's something that people are willing to do, contact me, and I'll probably set up one and see where it goes. Last year I tried to start one and it didn't go that well, but also I couldn't do, I didn't have time to do promotion and stuff like that. So it kind of fell off the face of the earth due to other priorities. But now, I've been thinking about doing some of those kind of projects, and if I can help people to back them, that would be great.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for speaking to us today. You've been on my radar for a long time. I love your work. I'm so glad you're active in groups like the American Humanist Association, and it was a thrill to have you today. So just really quickly before I close out the recording and open the floor, we have an event on, here, I can share my screen now. Here we go. We have an event on Tuesday of next week. We're hosting Ron Millar, who's the coordinator of the Center for Free Thought Equality, on a presentation for, I don't think my screen sharing is it? I'll get there eventually. We have a presentation by Ron Millar, who's coordinator of the Center for Free Thought Equality. It's a great presentation on how to support atheist causes and candidates. This is going to be a kind of a series on the election we're doing right now. He helps and follows a PAC that coordinates and helps candidates running for office around the country. And yeah, we'd love for you to show up. Also, the Secular Student Alliance is co-hosting that event and talking about their Secular America Votes program, which is a voter registration program. Wonderful. All right, and with that, I'm going to end the recording. Thank you again, Dr. Navarro.